Thank you all for being here. My name is Alex Zhang. I'm the Associate Dean for Information Services at the Duke Law School. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Faculty Author Talk series. Before we begin, I would like to thank Professor Gina Gill Fletcher and her office for sponsoring the lunch, and to our colleagues in IT and media services, as well as my wonderful partners, Jennifer Behrens and Shauna Bangro from the library for making this all happen. Today, we're here to celebrate Professor Dorian N. Coleman's latest work on Sex and Gender, a Common Sense Approach. It is published by Simon & Schuster. Professor Coleman is the Thomas L. Perkins Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke Law School. She's renowned for her interdisciplinary research, which explores the intersections of law with many topics such as women, children, sports, and medicine. And here's a fun fact. Guess who in this room is four-time All-American and also won the 1982 U.S. National Collegiate Indoor 800 meters? Shout it out. Who is that person? That's our Professor Coleman. And this is just some of her remarkable achievements on the track that I'm sure informed her research on law, sports, and society. We're also very privileged to have Professor Jeff Paul with us today to moderate the conversation. Professor Paul has been a member of Duke Law faculty since 1989. Before joining Duke, he served as a professor of law at both University of Iowa and George Washington University Law School. He has held multiple positions in both state and federal government, including serving with the U.S. Department of Justice from 1993 to 2000, and again from 2011 to 2012. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Coleman and Professor Paul.
Thank you, Alex. It's my very great honor and a real personal pleasure to speak at this celebration of Dorian Coleman and her book. And I'll talk about them eventually. But let me begin by telling you a story. It's a story from a century and a half ago. The human world in which people made decisions, personal decisions, social decisions, political decisions. This social world was quite straightforward. There were two sexes, not more, not less. Gender was an attribute of words, not of human beings. These two sexes, to which everyone belonged, were each marked by substantially different and discrete attributes. Men were hard, strong, cerebral, aggressive, sexually attracted to women. Long list. Women were soft, weak, emotional, timid, romantically attracted, or at least acquiescent to men. And these characteristics were both descriptive, this is just the way things are, and normative. This is the way you have to be. You need to be. One's place in the human world was largely dictated by your sex and by this list of descriptive and normative characteristics. This account of the human world was, to many people, so powerful, so self-evident, that in 1873, Justice Joseph Bradley inscribed it into the pages of the United States reports. I'm going to quote him. The civil law, as well as nature itself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. Man is, or should be, woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy, which belongs to the female sex, evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. Therefore, it's within the province of the legislature to ordain what offices, positions, and callings shall receive the benefit of those energies and responsibilities and that decision and firmness which are presumed to predominate in the sterner sex. Now, there are a number of things you can say about this story. Perhaps the two most important words. Number one, it wasn't true at the time. And number two, it was deeply oppressive and unjust. Lots of people, as Justice Bradley was writing his words, lots of people knew that this account of sex and its role in human life was shot through with ungrounded assumptions and wild generalizations. And lots of people knew that this story was contrary to their own experience of being a human person. It was a story that demanded of them that they deny or conceal, perhaps even from themselves, truths about themselves. And for those who saw through the story, it was interlinked with other oppressive ideological constructs, most importantly, the American story of race. As the great Frederick Douglass once said, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." Now, the irony of it escaped Justice Bradley, it seems, but he was given the opportunity to pen the concurrence from which I have quoted because someone named Myra Bradwell, a woman, had refused to live by the story he was eulogizing. Bradwell was a living contradiction of Bradley's words. She was an increasingly prominent journalist and political activist in her home state of Illinois when she asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review the state Supreme Court's decision that she could not be admitted to the bar solely on the grounds that she was a woman. The court, 8-1, rejected Bradwell's constitutional challenge. And as we've already seen, with Bradley explaining that not just on the basis of the U.S. Constitution, but on the basis of what he called the general constitution of things. Less than 2 months after he issued those words, a young woman, Bradwell's protege, Alta Hewlett, was admitted to the Illinois bar because of the powerful and quite aggressive political advocacy of Hewlett and Bradwell. Justice Bradley's simple binary story was starting to unravel even as he told it. Now let's just move forward 150 years to today, to 2025. Justice Bradley's story has come apart altogether. Are there two sexes? Are there more than two? Or is sex itself an unwarranted ideological fiction? Every view has its advocates. Gender is no longer confined to grammar. It now serves as a critical language for discussing human experience, the social world. Bradley's smug assumptions about women and their, quote, peculiar characteristics, destiny, and mission lie shattered on the floor in a world in which 4 members of Justice Bradley's court are women. People whose identities and very existence Bradley ignored, gay people, lesbian people, trans people, are a prominent and public part of society. Bradley's world is gone. But what has taken its place? One thing is clear, we have settled on no orthodoxy parallel to Bradley's about sex and gender. We are currently engaged in fierce arguments over whether Bradley's orthodoxy, rooted as it was in assertions about sex, was a perversion of genuine truths about humanity or an outright fraud. And one of the flashpoints in our debates concerning one of the flashpoints in our debates in general is a specific debate over the rights, equal rights of trans people, a question that yesterday's executive order puts up in the headlines. The importance of questions about the rights of trans people and about the role of sex and gender more broadly, the importance of those questions is obvious, but how we go about answering them, well, we don't have any agreement. I think it's perfectly understandable, given the predominance of heat over light in much of the discussion. If someone says, you know, I want to think about these issues critically and reasonably, justly and empathetically, but I don't know where to start. I have a lot of sympathy with that. I have an answer for you. The place to start is by reading Dorian Coleman's outstanding book on sex and gender. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes explaining to you why I say that, the reasons, I'm going to give you 5, the reasons why, if you have any interest in any of these issues, you need to read this book. And it doesn't matter where you start, whether your sense is, from what you hear about it, that you'll agree with Dorian largely or disagree with her. It doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter where you end up. This is a book, and this is one of its amazing virtues. This is a book that's written for everybody, regardless of viewpoint, by which I do not mean it is some attempt at finding some milquetoast, don't offend anybody, quite the opposite. This is not a book by Justice Bradley, secure in his personal position against any personal blowback. Nor is this a manifesto written by somebody who only cares about the other people in her movement and therefore is unconcerned about criticism because she's adhering to the movement's talking points. Writing and publishing on sex and gender demanded of Dorian real social courage. Why do I say that? Well, she makes no bones about who she is. We're told in the book, she's a liberal Democrat. She's a feminist. She's someone who has been associated with, actively involved in movements for equality that people would describe as coming from the left or the progressive perspective. She has written a book in which it was utterly foreseeable that many people, traditional friends and allies politically of her, will be harshly critical. While at the same time, since it is a book written by someone who is clearly a liberal Democrat and a feminist, etc., it's a book that's going to take heavy criticism from people on the right. It takes real social courage to write and publish such a book. And her willingness to put herself on the line and also the esteem in which other people hold her, that itself to me is a good reason to read the book, because it's a book that's written by somebody who's a smart person and has to be quite serious about what she's saying. She's not just appealing or seeking applause. All right, second reason why you need to read this book. It's courageous in a different sense. It's intellectually courageous. We live in an era in which ever-broadening swaths of public discourse, and for that matter, private conversation, are dominated by one of two forms of talk, which I'm going to call authenticity and dogmatism. On the surface, these two styles of talking sound very different. The justification a speaker employing the mode of authenticity gives for assertions that he makes boils down to, well, that's my opinion. Turned around and uttered to the person who disagrees with the speaker, that becomes, that's just your opinion. Speech in the dogmatism register on the surface sounds different, diametrically the opposite, in fact. What I just said is the unimpeachable truth. It's not just an opinion. If you hesitate to accept what I've said, or if you raise questions about any aspect of it, you merely show your stupidity or your malice or your prejudice. Now, the modes of authenticity and dogmatism differ, but only on the surface, in the different words their practitioners use to come to the same result. Regardless of whether you can't disagree with me because all assertion is a matter of opinion, or because my assertions happen to be the facts as all right-thinking people understand them, regardless of which one I take, which way I express it, reasoned disagreement with me is impossible, excluded by definition. Speech in either the authenticity or the dogmatism register renders the speaker invulnerable to criticism, free of self-questioning, and incapable of learning from others, and in the end, incapable of teaching others. This is a general problem, but it's clearly present in much debate over the rights of trans people, which too often begins, and when it begins, it must end up in authenticity or dogmatism. Think of the following two statements. It's my opinion, or it's the unimpeachable fact, that trans women are women, period. And it's just my opinion, or it's the unimpeachable fact, that trans women are men, period. Whichever one I say, no reasoned conversation can follow, only acquiescence or shouting. But there's a third mode of public and private discourse, one that permits and indeed invites and welcomes conversation and disagreement, and offers the possibility of learning from others things you don't already know, and of them learning from you. It's the register of truth and explanation. And the second sense in which this book is courageous and a must-read is that it is written throughout in terms of truth and provides the reasons for thinking the assertions it makes to be true and their opposites to be false. To read a book on this topic, written in this mode, is tremendously refreshing. To write it required Dorian not just to swim against the political currents, to find herself in a crossfire between former allies and traditional opponents, but also to swim against the tide of much discourse in the academy in particular. And yet she did it. From the beginning of her book on, she writes on the assumption that what is true is not a matter of opinion or dogma, but the result, the conclusion we come to when we search for explanations for what we observe and what we think, explanations that can become, potentially, common understandings through reasoned debate. And she wages vigorous battle at several points in the book with anyone who seeks to control debate by controlling language. She herself is, by the way, admirably clear in her use of words. She insists, I think persuasively, that we need to keep the word sex to speak of biological truths about human beings as a species, and we need the word gender as a way of discussing truths about individual human experience and social perception. Dorian's equally clear, by the way, about the reasons for her substantive views on contested issues. A substantial part of On Sex and Gender, chapters 1 and 4 to 6, is devoted to laying out the arguments why Dorian is persuaded that biological sex and the distinctions it draws between the vast, vast majority of human beings who are biologically either women or men, that these are realities with which we must deal if we are to live our own lives and if we are to treat others justly. On the overall framework of truths about sex that Dorian presents, I think she's persuasive. But again, whether you end up agreeing with her or not, her book invites you to think and consider. It doesn't demand that you agree. My third reason for commending On Sex and Gender to you is that the book is not dispassionate. But wait a minute. Didn't I just congratulate her for not being a rhetorical bully, and now I'm turning around and saying she is? No. Reasoned argument on anything of importance is not a matter of laying claim to an Olympian disinterest, detachment from the subject of the debate, but of treating the reader with respect as someone who is entitled to a candid presentation of the writer's thinking and who is entitled equally to think for herself and to disagree. If the issues on debate are important to human beings, as those Dorian discusses surely are, an attempt at detachment, in fact, risks obscuring the truth. What I look for when I read a book on such a subject are signs that the reader views the topic with the seriousness it deserves, and I deeply admire Dorian's willingness in this book to show her own emotional and existential commitments, in part because in doing so, she better enables me to evaluate her intellectual arguments. No one who reads On Sex and Gender will have any doubt where Dorian stands, not just on specific issues, but on the personal and emotional importance to her of the matters the book concerns. As Alex has already said, this is a book by an athlete, a national champion runner in the 1980s in 2 nations, I believe, worried that we as a society will fall back from the progress we have made in opening up for girls and women the possibilities of athletic excellence. She cares about this deeply. This is a book by a feminist, reared by the truly remarkable mother whom you meet in the book, who, largely because of that mother's shaping influence, is passionately committed to continuing to address the woman question in the terms that Justice Ginsburg famously described it. Quoting Ginsburg, "Physical differences between men and women are enduring. The two sexes are not fungible. Inherent differences between men and women are cause for celebration, but not for placing artificial constraints on an individual's opportunity." This is a book that honestly confronts the tensions between Dorian's worries and commitments that I've just mentioned, and our equally passionate commitment to fairness and justice for all persons. My fourth reason for urging you to read On Sex and Gender is that this is a book of remarkable depth. When I was first thinking about what I could say about it, the word that kept coming to mind was comprehensiveness, because the book touches on so many different matters. You could have imagined someone with Doran's background in sport really focusing on those particular issues. But On Sex and Gender places that particular debate in the context of broader debates about the rights of trans people, and that debate in the still broader context of arguments about the equality and equal dignity of all human beings. On Sex and Gender, therefore, gives us an amazingly broad account of how and why Justice Bradley's smug, ignorant, and unjust world came apart, and how we got to the confusion we currently find ourselves in on social and legal questions involving sex, gender, and equality. Dorian does this not by trying to discuss every issue and event that might be thought relevant. Comprehensiveness was not quite the right word. But rather by taking us deep into the questions through a remarkable combination of detailed information on some points, broad thematic strokes at other places, and throughout an uncanny ability to introduce us to particular individuals whose personal experiences embody and thus help us to understand the questions and the sweep of history and social change. One thing wrong with Justice Bradley's worldview, we eventually realize, was his eagerness to render invisible the individual, and in particular, individuals who failed to conform to his expectations. Doran avoids the errors of abstraction and overgeneralization by his remarkable use of concrete and individual detail. A good example is Myra Bradwell herself. In On Sex and Gender, she just isn't just the name of a Supreme Court decision. She is, as I've suggested, a fully rounded person, a major figure in Illinois political and legal life who died a financial tycoon on the basis of her own work, and whose accomplishments Doran deftly sketches for the reader. Or another example. Unsurprisingly, we meet and get a real sense of a number of athletes of different sexes and of different gender identities who are affected by or caught up in our current debates. Or again, there's that well-known exchange between Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Senator Marsha Blackburn during Justice Jackson's confirmation hearings, which is recounted with a contextualization and with a respect for both people that is, I think, usually lacking in discussions of the event. One of my favorite examples, we read about the beauty and the symbolic meaning of Michelangelo's David, of the Venus de Milo, and of other works of sculpture, on the way towards understanding more deeply Doran's argument that biological sex is real, a truth about humanity, and also a good truth, a beautiful thing. Throughout the book, people and issues that are obviously relevant, Justice Ginsburg and equal protection, the role of puberty blockers and gender-affirming care, and issues and persons that are not so obvious, the saintly Pauli Murray and the military draft in Ukraine. These are brought into, and they serve to fill out and humanize our understanding of the issues and our understanding of the human world as Doran invites us to envision it. My fifth and final reason for commending this book to you is that it is a deeply hopeful book. In 2025, we, the people of the United States, do not usually sound much like we think we've achieved a more perfect union. And it's not very clear how we go about doing so, given what we ourselves say is our hyperpolarization and our deep, it looks like oftentimes unbridgeable disagreements. It's enough to be depressed about. Doran's book comes from a different vision and one that's hopeful. From Doran's perspective, we mustn't give up on the possibility of talking to others with whom we disagree passionately and seriously on important things. because in doing so, that in itself renders the human community and the particular political community of the United States in itself, just doing that, more just, more humane. And beyond that, by actually being able to listen to others and being hopeful that doing so, they will hear me, I will hear them, we are enabled to see a way past our disagreements, not to eliminate them all. We're never going to agree on everything, including on some of the issues that this book touches on, but to find ways to live together despite our disagreements and to find practical, humane, and just resolutions to those practical problems that we can't avoid somehow resolving. It's a fabulous book. Now, you may be saying, but yeah, there's got to be something wrong with it. Well, I don't agree with every single position Dorian takes, but that's of exceedingly small interest and importance. My big disagreement, the thing I really don't like about this book, is the subtitle, A Common Sense Approach. When I was a little boy, common sense was what my elders always said I was lacking. And so it really puts me off to find it used in this context. But of course, Dorian's not using it quite the way my elders were using it. She's saying, you know, if we do listen to one another, if we do understand our disagreements as disagreements about what is true, there's some reason to hope that by listening and talking, we can make some progress towards at least solving issues that we must somehow practically resolve. So it's a great book, Dorian. Congratulations. I admire it endlessly.
Thank you. I'm going to blame the subtitle on the bigwigs at Simon & Schuster. That would be truth. So, Jeff, there aren't enough words to say how grateful I am, not only for your incredibly generous remarks just now.
They're just true.
It's your opinion. But also for your support of On Sex and Gender in Progress. Jeff read important sections of it to make sure that I was at least as right as he and I could be together on law facts and things like that, and Polly Murray, whom we have in common for different reasons. But also over the years, Jeff was instrumental in the publication of my first book, Fixing Columbine, many years ago, and the constancy of your support has meant more than you can know. I recognize Dean Abrams in the acknowledgments, and I want to do that again here. It's really not easy to be a dean in these turbulent times, and I'm certainly personally fortunate, but I believe that Duke is also fortunate for the mission-driven and clear-eyed way you've navigated them. Thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I see faculty, students, staff in the room, and it's just extraordinary. Thank you. I had an entirely different plan for my own remarks today, but I scrapped them. It's impossible this week not to begin with the executive orders. Starting on day one, with defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. In the short time since that order was issued on January 20th, the administration has also issued prioritizing military excellence and readiness, protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation, ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling, and just yesterday, no men in women's sports. There's a way to see Trump's day one executive order, and if you stretch it, the set, as mere negatives of Biden's day one order and its regulatory sequelae. People will do this, but it will be wrong. Here's how it will go in brief. Interpreting the court's 2020 decision in Bostock, Biden's day one order announced that his administration would interpret the word sex throughout federal law to include gender identity, a person's innermost sense of themselves as male, female, both, or neither. It ordered all administrative agencies to comb their records to ensure this definition governed the administration's actions. And it suggested it would proceed blind to sex as biological sex, including where sex classifications remain lawful, but not blind to gender identity, because seeing that is necessary to secure trans rights. Fast forward 4 years. Interpreting Bostock, Trump's Day 1 executive order announced that his administration would interpret the word sex in federal law traditionally as biological sex, the human organism as male or female from conception, not also as gender identity. It ordered all administrative agencies to comb their records to ensure this definition governs the administration's actions, and it clarified that the administration will proceed blind to gender identity, especially where sex classifications remain lawful, because seeing only sex is necessary to protect women's rights. This basic negative reading standing alone misses that this administration's Day 1 and Week 1 executive orders don't just restore the historical status quo. They don't just erase Biden's affirmative support for trans people and a definition of sex that includes gender identity. They're also an aggressive effort to unsee trans people as trans. A trans man, for example, and what follows are quotes from the EOs, not my words. A trans man is only a female, and to the extent sex classifications are relevant, he is to be supported as the woman reality knows him to be. Under the terms of the orders, especially in combination, it's hard to understand how a trans person can be trans, or at least well as trans, in contexts affected by this federal government. For some, that seems to be the point. You see evidence of this in the fact that while the orders were partly motivated by personal, including religious priors, and by secular policy preferences, some of which I share, they're also motivated by inexperience and animus. This is most evident in the order called Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness, which claims that trans people can't be warfighters and have no place in effective fighting force. Here's the money quote. Expressing a false gender identity, divergent from an individual's sex, cannot satisfy the rigorous standards necessary for military service. Beyond the hormonal and surgical medical interventions involved, which the order suggests is enough standing alone to justify exclusion, beyond those, adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to be an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life. A man's assertion that he is a woman and his requirement that others honor this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness of a service member. There's so much to contest here, but my point in sharing it was to demonstrate that the administration is going beyond rejecting the contested claim that, for example, a trans man is a man, which is an application of the proposition that sex includes gender identity. It's also taking the further position that his gender identity itself is false. And this is the product of inexperience and animus. The brief that was immediately filed in response to this order, co-authored by Professor Jennifer Levi, who is teaching here this semester, meticulously documents the facts that continue to support the military's current trans-inclusive accession and retention policies. Different cases will do the same for aspects of the other orders, including because of Bostock and also because of Loper Bright. Everybody's throwing Loper Bright around, so I need to do that too. Partisan lawyering aside, Bostock does support the proposition that where distinctions on the basis of sex are verboten, it's just as unlawful to take a trans person's sex into account as it is anyone else's. And Loper Bright, there's so much to say here, but for now, especially for students and staff, it bears repeating that new administrations can change executive policy. That's in part what you get when you win the presidency. But no executive order can take away rights that exist in law, including in statutory law, if the courts do their job. In the meantime, as we sort the authorized from the unauthorized, and within the authorized, the sensical from the nonsensical, I didn't say common. No. Both the coarse cuts and the onslaught, are wreaking the kind of havoc that arbitrary treatment by leaders always does. Trans people are understandably frightened today, and we should notice this and be kind. I'll close with a few related words about the book. I've said that I share some of the policy preferences embedded in the Day One order. The details matter here as always, but in broad strokes, this is what it includes. Defining sex as biological sex. For me, this standard definition from Oxford is useful. Either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and many other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. If you don't like that one because it centers reproductive functions, this one from Black's Law Dictionary works too. The sum of the peculiarities of structure and function that distinguish a male from a female organism. I also agree that we shouldn't use the word gender to mean sex. For me, though, this is so that we can see and work with sex and gender, then specifically with gender as gender identity, but also traditionally as gender roles and gender expression. One of the battles among feminisms in this period is the co-opting of the word gender to mean only or mainly gender identity, which can have the effect of marginalizing necessary ongoing work on gender roles and gender expression, especially as these start from sex. One more. Continuing the commitment to valuable evidence-based exceptions to general non-discrimination rules, such as the sports exception to Title IX. Unlike the administration in that context specifically, as I describe in the book, I'd add accommodations for gender identity where inclusion does no harm. They don't. On the sports question, which looms large today, the second to last chapter in general is on the politics of sex and gender. Among other things, for example, the academic freedom and civil discourse issues I discussed at a FedSoc event here at the law school in September. The chapter describes what I see as overreach on the right and the left since 2015. It includes how girls and women's sports have been used by both sides as the locus of the battle over the definition of sex in society and law. It explains that for the principal players, it was never just or even at all about sports. And I'm going to read just a few passages on that point. On May 17, 2019, the Democrats in the House of Representatives brought the Equality Act to a vote on the floor of the chamber. As we saw in the introduction and then in more detail in Chapter 3, the act defines sex in federal law to be sexual orientation, gender identity, sex stereotype, and sex characteristics, but apparently not biological sex itself. Indeed, its proponents are adamant that we not say biological sex. Beyond that, it takes the step the Supreme Court in the United States versus Virginia wouldn't. It requires sex blindness in all federally funded programming as well as in all public accommodations. It defines public accommodations broadly to include all goods and services, whether these are provided in physical spaces or not. Directly or indirectly, its passage would close the door to any exceptions that would allow us to continue to celebrate sex, to compensate women for historical discrimination, and as Justice Ginsburg would have allowed, to advance full development of the talents and capacities of our nation's people. Republican legislators introduced an amendment on the floor of the House that would have created an exception for girls and women's sports. In effect, the proposed amendment was for a yay or nay on continuing the 50-year-old legal commitment we know colloquially as Title IX, a regulation that is interpreted by the courts requires separate sex teams as the way to ensure equality for female student athletes. This was savvy gamesmanship, since support for girls and women's sports has become a proxy for support for female empowerment. The amendment failed along party lines. The Republicans voted for it, the Democrats against. H.R. 5 itself passed, also along party lines. Given that the GOP wouldn't have voted for the act anyway, and that it had no chance in the Senate, it was all perverse political theater of the highest order. If you don't follow sex in sports because you don't care about sports or women's sports or whether some trans women and non-binary males win some championships set aside for females, know that most advocates and politicians who are working on the issue don't really care either. The right fought equity in athletics from the beginning. It's still not fully committed, something the left enjoys pointing out whenever the occasion arises. That it was the GOP and not the Democrats that invited me to Capitol Hill to testify in support of Title IX and that it introduced the amendment to the Equality Act to save women's sports was off the charts ironic. The left can be equally disingenuous. True to the policy choice to ignore even real sex differences, their leading voices repeatedly demonstrate disregard for competition, the biology of human performance, and the sex-based rationale for the female category. This rationale is obviously undermined by the demand that we ignore sex in the eligibility standards. For those of us who do care about sports, their disregard is hard to stomach, as there is no other plausible basis for the category. It's certainly not about affirming femininity, which would actually be myth and stereotype. As they erode the foundation, they say it's okay if females don't win, because what matters is participation, not the podium. The fact is that people in both camps, those who claim to be saving women's sports and those who claim that real sex differences are myth and stereotype, are using the institution as a proxy for the ultimate questions: whether sex still means sex, whether we can still see it and say that it matters, whether, as humans have done since time immemorial, we can continue to use it to sort people to meet individual and collective needs. If not in arenas as purely physical as athletics, then nowhere. This was the reason for the political theater in the nation's capital. The pitch in the final chapter of the book is for us to reject both the claim from parts of the left that we'd all be better off if we were blind to sex, and the claim from parts of the right that we'd all be better off if we were blind to gender diversity, including to trans people as trans. It's for us to be smart about sex and smart about gender. I don't pretend it's always easy to be this way, to practice this way of thinking. I'm here in part because it's not, and because I work in the difficult space in where sex and gender collide. I also don't pretend there's a way to make everyone happy. There isn't, as Jeff said. Or that I have all the answers. I don't. What I am saying is that it's worth a lot of us doing the work to arrive at a place where, for example, it's fine to be female and fine to be trans. In the meantime, as messy as it is, that place exists where I exist, including in my classroom. Thank you.
We have some time. Questions? Comments? This is a conversation. Yes.
Hi, yes. Dr. Coleman, thank you for taking the time. I'm kind of thinking about this question during your presentation. I admit I have not yet read the book. I'd love to understand, if you can elaborate, your delineation of what biological sex is, only because when we take into account, for example, in sports, intersex people, people with XXY chromosomes, people with XX chromosomes with maybe elevated testosterone comparatively. Just thinking like a law student, what is that bright line on how you define biological sex and how these variations can interplay in sports? Why did you decide this line versus others, for example?
Great question. It's one that's asked a lot, and so well-formed and all of that, right? So the conditions that you're describing, the XY conditions, and I speak in sort of in the international sports world, in the regulatory space, we've come to talk about X athletes and XY athletes because both XX athletes and XY athletes are often gender diverse, and they have all kinds of other sort of personal attributes. When we're focused on the male category and the female category, we're focused on sex, and so that's what we're talking about. And so XX and XY are sort of proxies, good sort of proxies for talking about sex without purporting to speak about someone's gender identity, because we actually don't necessarily know what it is, right? So, and we're focused on the biology. So first of all, we're focused on the biology because that's the reason the sex classifications exist, right? They exist because of biological differences between males and females that essentially make it impossible for female athletes to have any chance at even being in the international sports space, for example, and at elite level in the United States, the same thing, if we didn't classify athletes by sex. And so by definition, we need to do that if we care about sex equality and the other goals that the institutions have for their female category and their male category, for that matter. And so then that begs the question, right? How do we determine sex? How do we test for sex? And I don't mean sex testing in the old model, of nude parades and all that, but just how we would judge eligibility, sex test in that sense, right? So the conditions that you talk about are very rare. They're overrepresented in the female category at elite global level, but they are exceedingly rare. And each of them can be the differential diagnosis for sex, which is a standard medical procedure that exists outside of sports, right? It's not a diagnostic that was established for sports. Sports uses the standard medical diagnostic, or they send people to have it if they want to have it. That establishes sex basically 100% of the time. And so for us in the sports space, it's not a difficult proposition at all if you're comfortable with having a sex category and then understanding that it needs to be that there need to be standards for inclusion and exclusion from that category.
Other
Yes.
folks? Yes.
Thank you so much for this. This was fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to getting my copy of the book. And I really appreciate how you brought up the political theater aspect of this, and how, ultimately a lot of it's exploitative. Like, we know what messages do, and also why politicians engage in messaging. It's because, not everybody is as sophisticated as everybody in this room, whether that's faculty, students, staff. Like, you're really trying to communicate to, quote unquote, the everyday American. And so there is a purposeful warping of language to try to, galvanize people or make them feel fearful about the world changing around them at a rapid pace. I mean, even in the space that I work in, it's more like reverse discrimination, right? Which is like purposefully and willfully detaching why we have the anti-discrimination laws that we have to accommodate for a historical context that can't be wiped. And so I'm curious to know, because I also have not read the book, do you have any thoughts or prescription for the willful ignorance and how our politicians are, pushing people against each other and forcing, folks to take stances that are really just meant to purposefully be oversimplified and not actually allow for the nuance that you're fleshing out in the book?
Excellent question. I have tried since 2019, basically, to suggest to the people I have access to on both sides of this debate, and this debate meaning the larger debate, but including as it plays out in the sports space, that they all know language matters for the reasons that you just described, right? But that the language they are using, and both sides are using language that, or have used language that is I wouldn't say demonizing on both sides, because that's not fair, but is extreme and hurtful to one group of people or another group of people. That we're not going to get anywhere solving problems if that's what they really want to do, right? Solving problems. If you can't go into a room without using the right words, or you don't want to go into the room because someone has said a bunch of things about you that makes you not want to talk to them, right? That we're not going to get anywhere that way. It turns out, like, that's the political theater point, right? It turns out that they actually don't want to solve problems. They're using the words, in the case of the GOP, to win the election. It is said to have contributed to winning the election. I don't know that that's right or not. There's debate about that, but certainly it didn't hurt, and certainly their people had done, a lot of work to establish that as a hook, right? To get people who were more than just the base. The left has had, I've been subject to the left's version of it. It's not pretty either, and it's effective to some ends, right? It's effective to some ends. It's not effective for compromise. It's not effective for sausage making. It's not effective for bringing people into a room to talk. My solution to that is to try to get people who don't like that modus operandi, whatever their politics, wherever you are in the political spectrum, to get those people into a room, or to get those people just to speak, right? Just to talk in normal language. and be willing to talk to each other and give each other grace when maybe you use a word that's a little off, understand each other, and get moderates maybe. I mean, this is the political piece, right? To get moderates who are probably most of the American people, whether they're on the left or the right, to say, you know, we actually want to know more about this and other issues. We want to learn more. This is part, you know, in part why Simon & Schuster was interested in buying the book and pitching the book, was because they didn't see that out there, and they wanted it. So I think the more of us who are willing to talk, whatever the issue is, whether it's race or sex or something else, right, are willing to sort of forge a big path in the middle. And I don't mean, again, not compromise, not the milquetoast thing, but just, you know, stop screaming, stop saying these sort of extremist things, or I don't want to listen to them, and move forward from there.
Other folks? Yes.
Thank you, Dorian, for this wonderful book. Yes, we're having a conversation in this beautiful room at the law school. Can you have the conversation that you want when you're, you know, emulating if it's not a physical room? That is, if it's unfortunately the conversational space that most of us spend, or that most society spends time on, namely the internet, right, and all its variety. Is it possible? And so a room, a physical space like this where people still know ways to read books. Because that's not what happens. What prospects for the conversation that you're, you know, arguing for?
So I'm not, I mean, you know, I'm not on, thank you, Matt. You know, I'm not on the internet that way, right? I'm not on X, I'm not on, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, but that's about it, right? Partly because it's such a nasty space, including for me personally. But in the last, I would say, in the last 6 months, maybe 10 months, there have been, there are increasing spaces, blogs, podcasts, other kinds of vehicles that are providing that space. They weren't the only ones. This is the publisher, right? They weren't the only ones thinking there is a demand. You know, people are hungry for. There is a demand for a space, virtual or physical, where people can feel comfortable talking and disagreeing, and exchanging ideas and disagreeing agreeably or whatever. You know, all the stuff that we model, we try to model here, right? And that you guys all try to engage. It's there. It's growing. They have names, like I was on something recently called The Disagreement, and the idea, you know, and another one called Unsiloed. And they're, you know, it's small, but it's growing. And for those of you who have read the book, you'll know that and I did talk about this at the FedSoc event that here in September. There's a part of the book where I talk about how the legacy press, at one point for about 2-3 years, stopped publishing anything that wasn't on the left on these issues, and in fact followed a style guide that suggested that that you shouldn't publish the name of or any ideas from feminists who weren't who hadn't bought in completely hook, line, and sinker to everything that that the advocacy groups wanted. And that, you know, I was on that list, right, of people not to publish. And this is after having written an op-ed for the New York Times before, being cited repeatedly, Washington Post, the same thing. That's opening up again. And just to say that I have, as I was leaving to come down here an hour ago now, I counted 5 emails from different reporters at the New York Times in my inbox. And that's not about me. It really isn't, right? That's about an opening up of wanting to understand what happened, wanting to hear, wanting to not close your eyes and ears anymore to the fact that people have different ways of thinking, different ways of being, and that we need to talk to each other if we're going to be a successful political community.
So this is kind of the other half of Matt's question, and where you were, I think, going right now. I just wonder if there's anything in this political moment that makes you optimistic about both sides of seeing what the debate
I'm not, and thank you for coming, Kate. Kate was in the delivery room when I popped out my now 26-year-old. You're in my heart. I'm not very optimistic about, I mean, it's impossible, I'm not very optimistic about convincing people who are, and we shouldn't be, right? I don't mean not optimistic. We shouldn't try to convince a person who has a deeply held religious belief about something, right? There are people you can't convince, and to a large extent, those people, and they exist on the left from a different perspective, from a different grounding, right? There are those people who are never going to be convinced. They have the megaphone right now, but the rest of us don't have to sit here and do nothing.
I'm just thinking it would soften the edges on both sides.
How do we soften the edge?
A lot of the
Yeah.
right is not going to appreciate some of the stuff that's happening.
So let me say,
And the
yeah.
left can see what the result of their decision.
Yeah, I mean, so to me, the executive orders were, I think I have a story. It may not be exactly right. It may not even be right at all. I have a story that says, the Obama administration did this, the Trump administration did that, the Biden administration did this, the Trump administration did that, and it's like backlash back and forth, and both is extreme backlash, and that's partly why you get some of this really nasty language in these executive orders. I will say that the sports order, the last one, is written kind of normally. I was shocked when I read it, right? And I know I was in a conversation, and Jim was in the conversation as well, where there are some folks on the right who come at it from religion who assumed that the first set of orders was going to just seal the deal, right? We're going to have gotten our way on this stuff. And then one of them said, yeah, but I'm hearing that the way they were written and some of the stuff in them was just a little too much, is going to cause people not to hear what the substance of what we had to say, agree or disagree with that substance, right? And I don't know if that's why the sports order was written differently. I don't know if it was just a different lawyer, a different policy person who just doesn't write in that the way that, the money quote I gave you guys, right? But if they want to be effective, if they want to govern, they're going to have to soften on some stuff, I think. Yeah. I mean, I can be bummed, but I can't not be optimistic too, because otherwise, what are we putting one foot in front of the other about? This is where the jock in me comes out, right? No, I mean, let's be athletes about it. Seriously.
This part of the conversation has to end, but not the conversation. Thank you. Join me in thanking.